Okay, goedemiddag allemaal. Good morning, I guess I should say. Welcome to this little igloo. My name is Maarten Decat. I'm the co-founder and the CEO of the company called Elimity, and welcome to today's session about how to take control over user access within days, and specifically in the context of today's cybersecurity regulations. Regarding the session, there's time for Q&A at the end, but I don't mind being interrupted at all. So if you have a question on a specific slide, just raise your hand. Might be interesting for other people as well. And let's start by giving the good example. So raise your hand if you worry about whether there are still accounts in your systems that belong to people that already left your organization, and whether those people can still use those accounts. Raise your hand if you worry about who exactly has administrator rights to your critical service. Raise your hand if you worry about who can access privacy-sensitive data, like employee data, HR data, and other. Who here is afraid of external users? Who worries about robot accounts? All of these things, those are examples of cybersecurity risks related to who can access what, related to identities, to users, to permissions, to identity and access management. And so, with software as a service, cloud, working from home, the network perimeter has completely broken down, and these users, they're really the only thing still tying together all of the pieces in your IT landscape. And that's the reason that you see that these days, almost every successful hack initially started with an attacker taking control over credentials, taking control over some user account. It's also the reason why in modern cybersecurity approaches, they talk about things like minimizing the identity attack surface or applying least privilege. And it's also the reason why, if you have to comply to any of the major cybersecurity regulations, you should be able to prove that you're in control over who can access what. And so, cybersecurity regulations, compliance, those are terms that you'll probably hear a lot, so I thought that it's probably a good idea to start a bit from scratch. And what are we actually talking about? So these days, companies are really facing, I guess, a wave of cybersecurity regulations. I just picked some of the more well-known here on this slide. We all know GDPR with a focus on privacy. You probably also know about SOX, which is one of the first, I think, major cybersecurity regulation. It originated in the USA due to a large scandal of a publicly traded company, and it also applies to companies that are traded publicly in the US. We also have things like ISO 27001 or SOC 2, which are not really regulations, but more like frameworks that you can choose to confirm to, comply to. You have DORA for the financial sector, NIS2 for all of the sectors that are regarded as critical to the European Union cybersecurity regulation. So clearly, there's a lot. But luckily, the structure of the requirements, at least for these major regulations, is almost always similar. Typically 3 levels of requirements. So first, governance requirements, meaning that the management of companies is more and more made responsible for the actual risk management measures that are taken. And if you just do whatever you want, then they can even be held personally liable if something goes wrong in the end. Then you also have to apply risk management measures, of course. You have to do something to minimize your risk. Those are things that are typically in line, or they have to be in line with the actual risk that you're facing, depending on the industry that you're in, the data that you're handling, the stuff that your company builds, and the type of systems that you operate. And then you have reporting requirements as well. So if or when shit hits the fan, you should notify CSIRT, notify the government, notify the user that are involved if it's a data leak, and so on. Those are the typical 3 levels of requirements. And then depending on the regulation, like for example in NIS2 or DORA, there will definitely be supervision and penalties, but that really depends on which regulation you're currently in. And so regarding those risk management measures, there's lots of things that you can do and that you should do. For example, NIS2 even lists some of the things that you should do minimally to be able to comply to the regulation. And very broadly speaking, there are 2 categories. So you have organizational things that you should do, things like regular risk analysis or maybe set up incident handling processes and so on. And then more technical things like cybersecurity training, the asset management, basic cybersecurity hygiene, access control policies, and so on. And so in general, the challenge here these days is that there's lots of regulations. For some companies, it's new all of a sudden, especially in the context of NIS2. For other companies, in the context of DORA, it's again more and more your best that you have to do. That's the challenge. But the good thing is that by now we do know how to approach this challenge. So generally accepted, the first step that you should definitely do is take a risk management mindset and start thinking about that risk analysis. And you should know for your company where your critical assets lie. And that's something completely different between a chemical plant compared to a SaaS vendor like we are ourselves. So you should know what your crown jewels are that you should protect, and then think in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability. And secondly, make sure that you have the necessary processes defined, especially the incident handling process, because when things go wrong, you should be able to act fast and not think about what should we do now. And then thirdly, start applying those risk management measures first that decrease your cybersecurity risk the most. And so if you think back to the start of the presentation, if you know that we control less and less of the underlying infrastructure, if you know that attackers just come through the front door, then taking control over your users and their access will be one of the first things that you will have to do. You will have to know which levers, whether there are still lever accounts around. You will have to know who exactly has administrator rights. You should know who exactly can access privacy-sensitive data, or who can both submit and approve contracts. All of those things you should know and then minimize, to minimize the access risk. And that's the role of identity and access management within cybersecurity, to minimize the risk related to user access. And so as a result, like the slide says, having provable control over who can access what is just essential. It's one of the essential requirements for any of these major regulations. But in practice, you still see that many companies shy away from this. And I think that if I reflect on that, I think the market that I'm actually also a part of, the identity and access management market, is one of the major causes there, because the market, the traditional focus, is not answering these questions. It's rather effectiveness and automating so-called joiner, mover, lever workflows. And so, for example, if someone new enters, you see that in the HR system, then based on some attributes, they're given roles and you know where they have to have access and so on. That's all very important, don't get me wrong, especially if you're an organization of tens of thousands of employees, and probably there's just not enough sysadmins in the world to do that work manually. But if you look at this problem from a cybersecurity angle, then you only get the cybersecurity value, so the cleanup, at the very end of this very costly process, where you have to set up two-way connectors, where you have to define role models, you have to think about request and approval procedures and so on. And so as a result, if you're a smaller company, for example, with a smaller security team that have to do many different things, then they just don't do anything around identity and access management. And so the things that we then see in practice are companies of 500 employees with 2,000 active accounts in Active Directory, of which 200 are part of the domain controller groups. There's 2,000 more guest accounts in SharePoint, data shared all over the place, in file shares and so on. Those are actually actual tangible risks. And so as a result to that challenge, you see a new approach popping up over the last years within the market of identity and access management. It's been called data analytics, identity data fabric. Now, just this summer, Gartner has coined the term identity visibility in intelligence. Whatever you want to call it, the gist behind the approach is that you look at identity governance not as an automation problem, but rather as a data problem. So again, start with your, well, what is called here the operational sources. So think about which systems are critical to your cybersecurity, and 9 out of 10, that's Active Directory, Entra ID, any other major repositories, and then it can be file shares, SharePoint, databases, production systems, and development environment, whatever is important to your infrastructure, to your security posture. Those are the things, those are the systems for which you want to have the users, the permissions, the roles, to have that all in one central data layer. Ideally link that together into an identity data graph as well, and then use that for your governance, meaning that you can use that to find out risks and clean those up. Also put on access reviews, put on monitoring, have your key controls there, all based on the actual data. And that's a mindset that it doesn't do the same as a full IGA suite. It doesn't do the provisioning part, but at least it gives you visibility and control, and it minimizes your risks at a much lower total cost of ownership. That's the basic reasoning behind this approach. And very briefly, we at Elimity were a vendor of one of these identity visibility and intelligence platforms. We work with both companies of 500 people that have to do a lot with a smaller security team, up to companies of tens of thousands of employees that really want to strengthen their internal control even further. And the platform focuses on 5 key things. So most importantly, gathering that data without spending months or years of work. No, really want to have your top 5 systems in there in less than a week. So you can then start understanding who can do what, identify risks, and then going beyond just the reporting, also supporting you in a cleanup phase, indicating and tracking necessary changes, monitoring over time so you can stay on top of things proactively, and running access reviews to also include team leaders, application owners, and so on in this governance process as well. And the reasoning really behind this platform is to turn around the traditional IGA journey where you start with these heavy expensive steps, and here focus on that visibility as quickly as possible, identify access risks as quickly as possible, so we can then review that, address violations, and get notified of new violations. That's really the focus of this platform, and only then, once you've improved your cybersecurity posture, only then start thinking about the more costly, bigger steps, like, for example, designing role models or separation of duty policies, for which you then, by the way, have the perfect data layer as well, or introducing more governance processes like these requests and approvals or joiner mover leaver and so on. And then afterwards, only then start thinking about the actual provisioning part. That's where the real complexity from a technical point of view comes. But if you first cleaned up your environment, this step will also be a lot more easy, a lot more efficient to deploy. That's the general idea behind this approach. And so for the second part of the presentation, I wanted to give you an idea of what it actually looks like in practice. And so for this presentation, I chose a customer case of one of those companies from the first category that I talked about. So a company of 2,000 employees. They were not a bank or something. They had a very small security team, so 5 or 6 people, if I recall correctly, that had to do a lot of different things. And at some point, they also wanted to cover user access management. And specifically, the reason was, well, they wanted to decrease cyber risk. They had a new CISO, and he also wanted to cover this. But also, they were trying to go for ISO 27001 certification, and they really had to show that they're in control. And so, in a situation like that, our general approach is these 5 steps. And the first step is really what I just talked about, is that first visibility. So together with them, we talked about what are the essential data sources, and the 5 most primary ones were Active Directory, Enter ID, Azure itself, so a cloud environment, and then in their case also the local admins, so the admins on the different servers and laptops and devices that they had, and then also database admins as a form of, well, their critical applications and the data where it's actually stored. And so for those, you focus on out-of-the-box connectors, get that data in there in hopefully less than a few days, so you can start that investigation and clean up as quickly as possible. And in this case, and on that data, you then apply, sorry, I'm skipping ahead. One slide before that. Yeah, so you have your top 5 critical systems in there, and what we also heavily advised to do is to incorporate your HR system, because that gives you a lot of interesting metadata for all of these controls that you want to enforce, like the current status of a person, the end date, the job title, the place in the organization, the manager's name, and so on. And you link all of the accounts to the HR record, so you then essentially have a data foundation that shows you who can currently do what from the angle of a specific person. And so on that data, we then apply a framework of security controls. This is a framework we developed ourselves based on ISO 27001, and it talks about 8 categories of security controls. The most important ones definitely being these orphaned accounts that I already mentioned, so accounts that shouldn't be there anymore. And secondly, privileged accounts, so accounts that give elevated privileges. And the most strong finding that we can have, of course, is an orphaned privileged accounts, because you definitely do not want them to be in your systems. And then the other categories are access accumulation, where people can do more than they should be able to do. Identity hygiene and role hygiene, that talks about, well, groups without assignments, accounts without any roles, without any assignments to that. Those are just things, risk lying around to be misused. And then data quality, segregation of duties around financial systems. And then finally, also very important in practice most of the time, are business-specific policies, business-specific controls. And those are things that you probably know that are very important to your specific organization. And that can be separation between departments, separation between geographies, maybe production versus development environments, maybe members of critical groups, access to critical systems in production, all of those things. That's what you want to get into the system, so you then essentially get a library of essential security controls. that show you, based on actual data, where your major risks right now lie. And those can be things like admin AD accounts with linked to inactive employees and so on. And if there's a lot of them, and this is very high risk, and it should give you the insights to then start cleaning up and focus on those things that will lower your cyber risk as effectively as possible. And so the platform then also helps you, well, look into what are these accounts, what are they linked to, which employees are those, what's the last time that they logged on, all of that metadata. And if you even want, you can go into the details like maybe comparing the access of people in a certain team. That's something that is done a lot in practice because you would think that people in the same job title or same team would be able to do the same things. But we always see these red outliers where people can do way more than their direct colleagues, and that's almost always a sign of a faulty mover process. Because these people move throughout the organization, they're just given more and more accesses over time, never been revoked, and effectively you at some point have someone that is not labeled as an admin user but can do almost everything. And those are cyber risks then that you then want to focus on, that you can then clean up. And back to the specific case study. In that case, the CISO really had a strong focus on Active Directory first. He really wanted to focus on one system initially. Very easy connector for the platform. You get the out-of-the-box connectors there shipped with the platform as well. And so after a few hours, he had the data, had a view on these controls, and after a few days, they identified these admin orphaned accounts and were able to clean that up. And this was really important for this specific person because he really wanted to show to the rest of management that even though IAM has this image of being slow and tedious and costly, you can also make risk improvements very effectively. And this bought him a lot of goodwill, and then afterwards he expanded the scope of the deployment to these other systems that I talked about, so Enter ID, databases, and they've gone far beyond that right now. And these are really the first two steps that you see here, which we typically apply in an iterative mode, so you grow from your top 5 systems, top 10 systems, top 20 systems, and you scale the view, you scale up the scope of your visibility that you have in your organization. And so those steps, they really focus on the core security team. That's typically the people that are involved in those first 3 steps. But at some point, they don't know everything anymore. And you have to include other people as well. People like team leaders that are responsible for their team, or application owners responsible for certain systems, maybe site owners in SharePoint responsible for certain sites, or data owners responsible for certain file shares, whatever that fits within your governance structure. At some point you need to have their input as well in this cleanup exercise. And it can be that you have this control that says these are all orphaned admin accounts in Active Directory, but are these accounts really not used anymore, not needed anymore? That's something else even. That's probably something that you want to ask to the former team lead of the people that these accounts were meant for. And in our experience, these people don't want to do this. This is all still very technical information. So giving them access to the same overview that you saw before is too much of information, but rather you do this through a probably well-known business process called access reviews or recertification, where you ask a more specific question to those people. And so in this case, again, it's a typical process where you send out a question, people give their feedback, you turn it up into change requests. And if you're thinking of setting up these access reviews, maybe one word of advice from my experience at least. Again, these people, it's very technical information, they don't want to be involved here. If you just give them an overview of all the people in a certain team and all their Active Directory groups, people will just click accept all and be gone with it. And so in that case, it's much more efficient to start from those security controls that I've shown you before. Because that makes the question a lot more specific on the one hand. It says, well, hey, we from the security team, we see these accounts, we think that they shouldn't be there anymore because they haven't been used in the last 2 years. Can you give us our blessing to remove those? That's a much more specific question. It has the benefit of buying goodwill with those people. It's a form of education. But also you focus on those things that you know that are risky. So again, this will lower your cyber risk the most effective way. And that's how you take these people along in this process. And so that's step 4, where you include these people really in the mentality or in the task of a cleanup. And at some point when you have covered your most important risks. Then you can think of maybe growing to more continuous monitoring, more structural governance, where you repeat this exercise every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, depending on your risk appetite, and also allow the platform to do this for larger scopes, maybe in that case all of the AD accounts of a certain team and not just a part of that. That's how you grow towards full professional governance step by step. That's our general approach here. And so I always like to send you home with a bit of homework. If you looked at the title, I promised 5 tips. So when you get back to the office, even if you don't do it with our platform, if you're thinking of taking control over your users and your accesses, first start with that risk analysis. But we're here on a security conference. I would guess that you've all done that. You know what your critical systems are. And then my major point of advice, probably make this into a data exercise. Collect data, so the current users and permissions from those systems. Can even be that you just instruct some sysadmin to do some PowerShell scripts and get the data, link it together, apply those essential security controls. So if you want to do it manually, the link towards our guide is again on the next slide. But from my experience, the most important ones, orphaned accounts, privileged accounts, and then the business-specific policies. Act to clean up those risks. And then finally, and that's a step that I see that is forgotten a lot in practice, if you have done all of that work, also monitor. Repeat steps 2, 3, and 4, because that will show your progress. That will show that you're actually improving over time, that you're actually doing something. And that will, again, by goodwill, very important towards an auditor, internal or external, that you're actually actively working on this. And this is the gist behind the approach of identity visibility and intelligence. If you're interested, here is the QR code again to the guide that I promised. If this still sounds like too much work, then also know that our partners, in this case we're here with Cegeka, that they also provide this as an identity security assessment, so a service where they come into your organization and apply this methodology and deploy our platform, and then give you the perfect starting spot to continue on your next steps. And also know that we're just here 10 meters away, so if you have any questions, come join us there. And we also have an Elimity Beer, for which the guy there in the back is very proud of. Yeah. Yeah. And if there are any questions, thank you for your attention, and we have time to go in some questions right now. Thank you.